For days, the millionaire's son refused any food, until the new nanny does the unthinkable. She sits on the floor beside him, one spoon, one gesture, and the boy eats for the first time. But when the father arrives, what he does, no one expected. The silence in Robert Sterling's penthouse was an expensive thing, engineered with triple-paned glass and solid doors that blocked out the chaotic symphony of New York City. It was a silence that cost a fortune, but which, over the last few days, had become heavy, hostile. From the heights of his empire, with a net worth that landed him on Forbes billionaire lists, he watched the city light up, an ocean of indifferent illumination reflecting his most intimate failure. On the untouched white lacquer table, the silver tray was cooling. The organic, sodium-free zucchini puree, the unseasoned, finely shredded chicken breast, the fresh-pressed, sugar-free green smoothie. Everything was scientifically calibrated by an elite nutritionist, and everything was violently rejected by a 5-year-old boy. Leo was fading right before his eyes, and all the money in the world seemed useless. A mountain of colorful paper, unable to convince his own son to live. The doctors spoke of hospitalization, feeding tubes, and protocols that sounded like sentences. Robert felt a tight knot of dread mixed with irritation in his gut. He didn't have time for this. He had a meeting about a new hedge fund, gold prices were spiking, and a volatile crypto asset demanded his attention. The life of his capital was urgent, pulsating. His son's life was an impasse. He delegated affection the way he managed his minor assets, with efficiency and cold distance. Nannies came and went, pedagogues with impressive credentials, elite behavioral therapists charging 5 figures. None of them managed to penetrate Leo's wall of silence. The newest candidate was a desperate gamble by the agency, Elena. Hailing from a working-class neighborhood in the outer boroughs, a name he barely registered, with an accent that carried the sound of community life and neighborhood markets. Her eyes, however, possessed a calm that disarmed him. They were the eyes of someone who understood the urgency of real life, not the manufactured urgency of market fluctuations. He hired her purely out of exhaustion. And now, standing at the entrance to the playroom, a sanctuary of Scandinavian design and educational toys that were never touched, he was about to dismiss her too. The tray of food rested on the floor, rejected once again. Leo was huddled in a corner, clutching a grey cushion. This felt like the end of the line. But then, something different happened. Elena didn't insist, didn't argue, and didn't attempt a new psychological tactic. She simply sat on the floor, a respectful distance from the boy. She slipped off her flats with a quiet sigh, crossed her legs, and stayed there, in silence, merely sharing the same air. Robert frowned. What kind of method was this? After long minutes, she pulled a banana from her own handbag, peeled it slowly, and mashed it with a fork on a small plastic plate she'd brought. She sprinkled some classic baby oatmeal on top, the simple, sweet smell spreading through the antiseptic room. With her fingertips, she mixed it all together, unhurriedly, without disgust, and then she began to hum. A low melody, almost a whisper, an old classic R&B tune that spoke of backyards and deep nostalgia. The boy, who until then seemed like a statue, minimally turned his head. The smell reached him. He pulled back, suspicious, but then leaned forward, inhaling the air. Eleanor said nothing, just kept humming, her finger, sticky with banana, hovering in the air, waiting. Robert was ready to intervene, to say that this was unsanitary, that it wasn't protocol, that his son didn't eat that way. He opened his mouth to shut the scene down when he saw it. Leo crawled slowly across the rug, like a cautious animal. He sniffed Eleanor's finger, and then he opened his mouth. The first portion, small, almost insignificant, went in. Robert held his breath. He, who thought his money could buy silence, whose business acumen could quiet any pain, heard a sound he hadn't recognized in weeks, a sound no investment return could generate, the soft, relieved sigh of his own son swallowing. The world seemed to stop spinning. He, the man who moved millions, felt like the poorest of men, a paralyzed spectator before a miracle that hadn't cost a single dime. The gravity of that house, previously ruled by the cold logic of business and the weight of silence, shifted on a single, windy afternoon. The miracle of the mashed banana was not an isolated event. It was the trigger for a quiet revolution, orchestrated by Elena with the wisdom of one who understands that healing often enters through the senses. Robert, frozen at the doorway, felt the Italian marble floor tremble beneath his feet. This woman, with her hands sticky with baby oatmeal and her repertoire of old-school soul songs, had achieved in 10 minutes what a team of specialists, costing the equivalent of a small equity investment, hadn't managed in months. The gratitude that flooded him was uncomfortable, almost humiliating. It was the gratitude of a man who could manage the cash flow of a multinational corporation, but didn't know how to make his son eat. He felt like an intruder in his own life, a spectator of his own parenthood. In the days that followed, Elena wove a new routine, not with rigid schedules, but with sensory stimuli. She discovered that the sound of loud television agitated Leo, so she turned it off and tuned in an old AM radio station that played melancholic boleros and news read in sleepy voices. The smell of artificial cleaning fragrances made him recoil, so she started using only vinegar and lemon, and left the windows open so that the smell of the city, the distant siren and the rumble of the elevated subway, the aroma of rain on the asphalt, could enter and become part of the landscape. Food ceased being a clinical event at the dinner table and became an exploration. She cooked with him in her lap, letting him smell the garlic sautéing in olive oil, the steam from the rice cooker, the texture of a basil leaf. The house, formerly a design mausoleum, gained life, smells and sounds that couldn't be bought or measured. Robert resisted. He tried to frame Elena's method in a mental spreadsheet. "What is the pedagogical basis for this?" he asked once. And she merely smiled and replied, "It's the meat and potatoes approach, Mr. Sterling. You gotta smell it first, then you eat it." He was afraid of that chaos, that intimacy he didn't know how to navigate. While closing a multi-million-dollar deal over video conference, he heard the sound of pots clanging and Elena's laughter in the background. It was a dissonance that disturbed him. His instincts, trained to identify risks and opportunities in the financial market, screamed an alert. That proximity, that messiness, was a liability on his perfectly controlled emotional balance sheet. The tension exploded on a Thursday night. He arrived exhausted from a dinner with investors in a high-end restaurant in Tribeca, his head filled with numbers and profit projections. He found the kitchen, his immaculate kitchen, in a state of controlled disorder. And on the floor, sitting on an activity mat, were Eleanor and Leo, surrounded by small plastic bowls, their hands and faces smeared with creamy grits. Leo was smiling, a smile Robert hadn't seen in an eternity. And he, the multimillionaire in his perfectly tailored suit, felt a wave of shame so profound it left him breathless. Shame for his distance, his sterility, his inability to sit on the floor. He retreated into the shadow of the hallway, unseen, his heart beating wildly. That's when he heard Elena humming another melody, different from the R&B, softer, more intimate. A lullaby that scratched at an old memory, buried beneath layers of reports and concerns. An echo of a time when he himself sat on the floor, holding a baby. The melody continued, and a specific verse made his mind click. He knew that song. It was the music he used to sing, a long time ago, to put Leo to sleep, by pure instinct, moved by an unfamiliar force. He stepped out of the shadows and, his voice choked, completed the next verse. Elena went quiet, surprised, but it was Leo who reacted. The boy looked up at his father and, for the first time in months, leaned his head against his shoulder, leaving a small smear of creamy grits on the cool wool of his Brioni suit. The 4 weeks that followed were delicate stitching, a weaving together of rediscovered intimacies and still open wounds. Time, which Robert always measured in fiscal quarters and closing deadlines, began to be counted by Leo's Wednesday speech therapy sessions and Saturday mornings at the neighborhood farmers market. It was a new kind of calendar, governed by small victories, not grand profits. Leo's head on his shoulder that night was a turning point, a kind of emotional interest rate he didn't know his time investment could yield. He started observing Elena not as an employee, but as an artisan. She noted everything in a simple but hardback notebook, like a logbook of his son's soul. Leo doesn't like the noise of the blender, but he loves the sound of water running in the sink. The texture of papaya bothers him, but avocado calms him. The smell of mandarin oranges seems to be his favorite. He always smiles. These were data points no market analyst could collect. Insights worth more than any insider information about the stock market. Gradually, the ice between Robert and his son's universe began to melt. He started coming home earlier, leaving his cell phone on silent as he crossed the threshold. One afternoon, he found Elena trying to explain to Leo what stars were, using pieces of zucchini. He sat down beside them, awkward, and began to talk about constellations. He spoke of how ancient navigators used the stars to find their way, an unconscious metaphor for his own search. Between pots and spreadsheets, he still insisted on reviewing at night. A new routine established itself. He started drying dishes while Elena cooked. It was in this space, between the steam from the stove and the clinking of cutlery, that the first confessions emerged. Robert spoke of the conflict consuming him, the overwhelming guilt for having hidden in work since his ex-partner, Leo's mother, decided to seek a new start in another state. Her departure coincided with the boy's withdrawal. Her increasingly sporadic visits were procedural and painful, leaving a trail of silence and more questions. "I didn't know what to do," he admitted, his voice low. "I know how to build a business from the ground up, how to turn pennies into a fortune, but I don't know how to fix my son." Elena just listened, without judgment, and offered him a cup of lemon balm tea. But the external world, the world Robert dominated with such skill, does not forgive vulnerability. An old household employee, a driver who felt slighted by the attention given to Elena, saw the scene of the nanny feeding the child on the floor as an opportunity. Using his cell phone, he recorded a short video and sent it to a gossip blog. The caption was venomous, biased. "The billionaire's new nanny, strategy or affection? Sources say she's looking for more than a job." The image, taken out of context, showed the intimacy, the simplicity, and transformed it into something suspicious. The video went viral. The simple woman, the savior, was quickly painted as a social climber, a gold digger. The pressure on Robert was immediate. Image consultants, lawyers, partners, everyone said the same thing. "You need to control this narrative. This affects the company's image, investor confidence." Robert's instinct, trained for damage control, failed. He yielded. He called Elena for a conversation in his office, a cold, impersonal environment. He used corporate, empty words. He spoke of aligning conduct, discretion protocols, preserving the brand image. Every word was a knife. Elena, who until then had looked at him with genuine empathy, felt her face burn. Hurt clouded her eyes. She, who was sharing her heart, was being viewed as a liability to be managed. "I think you don't need me anymore, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "I think it's best if I leave." From the other side of the door, Leo, who followed Elena like a shadow, heard the word "leave." He froze, the glass of water in his hand, and his lips, which had rediscovered smiling, clamped shut, his mouth closed. The silence, like a starving ghost, returned to haunt the penthouse. Leo's silence was more deafening than any fire alarm. It was an accusatory silence, a sentence proclaimed without words that echoed through the penthouse and made Robert's fortune seem like a pile of useless rubble. The boy's mouth, which had become the barometer of that house, shut with a determination that chilled his father's heart. The food returned to being untouched. His gaze lost itself in the void again, and the spectre of hospitalization, which seemed exiled, returned to knock at the glass doors. Elena, hurt and humiliated, packed her few belongings into a backpack. Each folded piece of clothing was a silent farewell. Robert watched her from the doorway, pride and panic warring in his chest. He knew he was wrong. He knew his attempt to manage the narrative had destroyed the only authentic thing that had happened in his life in recent years. Apologizing, however, was a foreign currency in his emotional vocabulary, a crypto asset whose value he didn't know how to calculate. The twist, when it came, wasn't a gesture of humility, but an external attack. It arrived in the form of a stamped envelope, delivered by a court officer. His parents, Leo's paternal grandparents, with whom he maintained a distant and formal relationship, were filing an emergency custody petition. The document, drafted by one of the most expensive law firms in the city, was a cold, precise blow. They used the viral video and the boy's recent relapse as proof of his negligence. They alleged that Leo's selective eating was a symptom of emotional instability caused by an inadequate and poorly managed domestic environment. Elena's name wasn't cited directly, but her presence hovered over every accusation. She was the unqualified figure, the questionable influence. Her humble origins, once a curiosity, were now weaponized, an elegant whisper in the corridors of power that painted her as a dangerous intruder. The threat of losing his son did something no stock market crash ever could. It shattered Robert's armor. Fear overcame pride. He rushed to Elena's room, the paper shaking in his hands. "They want to take Leo from me," he said, his voice hoarse, devoid of any arrogance. "And they're using you to do it." Elena stopped folding a t-shirt and looked at him. The hurt was still in her eyes, but beneath it, Robert saw the same calm strength that had impressed him on the first day. She didn't panic. She just read the document, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They are wrong," she said, simply. In that moment, Robert understood. He had spent his life building strategic alliances, forming partnerships based on profit and power, but the only ally he needed now was this woman whose only wealth was a notebook of observations and a deep understanding of his son's soul. The first micro-victory came the next day. Instead of dismissing her to appease the situation, as his lawyers suggested, Robert made the first purely instinctive decision in years. He kept her. More than that, when he was summoned for the first meeting with the legal team and his parents, he broke all protocols. Elena walked into the boardroom beside him. The surprise on his parents' faces, the elegant grandmother and the austere grandfather, was palpable. The lawyers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Her presence there, a simple woman in the middle of that game of power and dollars, was an affront, a declaration. The city, always attentive to the movements of its billionaires, observed. Gossip blogs, which had previously painted her as a villain, were now divided. Was she the nanny savior or the source of the crisis? The elite who frequented Robert's same restaurants found her presence at tables of decision strange. In the merciless court of public opinion, the case was becoming increasingly complex, and Robert Sheen, for the first time, wasn't fighting for more money or more power. He was fighting for his family, and his only weapon was loyalty to a woman he barely knew, but to whom somehow he entrusted his son's life. The decision to keep Elena by his side was like buying an extremely high-risk stock, an act of pure gamble, challenging the logic of the market and the advice of all his analysts. For Robert, who built his fortune based on precise calculations and risk mitigation, the feeling was dizzying. The war, however, was only beginning, unfolding on two fronts. The first, public and noisy, was the judicial battle for Leo's custody. The second, silent and corrosive, was a crisis installing itself at the heart of his corporate empire. An important contract, negotiated months earlier with an international consortium, began to show problems. Rumors of mismanagement, leaked from within his own company, gained traction, fueled by the narrative of his personal instability. Investors, who once viewed his coldness as an asset, now interpreted it as negligence. His company's reputation, a commodity as precious as his capital, was collapsing. The pressure became unbearable. An emergency meeting was scheduled in Miami. It was an unavoidable trip, a desperate attempt to reverse the crisis, to stop the bleeding. His partners were clear. His presence was fundamental to calm investment funds and save the business. The trip, however, coincided with the date Leo's pediatrician had set for a crucial evaluation. After the relapse, the doctor recommended a brief 48-hour hospitalization to monitor the boy's weight and hydration, a precautionary measure to avoid a more severe condition. Robert found himself at an impossible crossroads, a conflict of priorities that exposed the fracture in his life. On one side, the empire he built, the source of his wealth and power. On the other, his son, fragile and silent. At the moment, he needed him most. He tried to postpone the trip, reschedule the meeting, but the market doesn't wait. Cash flow doesn't forgive absences. Pressured, exhausted, and confused, he made the choice he always made. He chose work. While the private jet took off from Teterboro Airport, slicing through the grey sky, Elena held Leo's small, cold hand in a hospital bed. The decision to admit him was confirmed, and Robert, by phone, authorized everything, promising to return as quickly as possible. Elena felt the weight of that responsibility, a burden that wasn't hers, but which she embraced with a strength she didn't know she possessed. In the simple hospital room, with the smell of antiseptic in the air and the constant beep of monitors, she recreated the penthouse sanctuary. She asked the nurse to dim the lights, took her small battery-powered radio from her bag, and tuned into the same AM station playing boleros. She hummed the old chorus, the melody a thread of hope in the sterile environment. She offered Leo some lukewarm gelatin, the only thing the hospital nutritionist allowed. And, most importantly, she kept her gaze steady on his a silent promise that she wouldn't abandon him. Robert returned the next morning, his eyes red from exhaustion and failure. He spoke with 3 investment funds and lost 2. The meeting had been a disaster. The scent of defeat clung to him. He entered the hospital room and saw the scene. Elena asleep, sitting in an uncomfortable armchair, her hand still intertwined with Leo's, who slept soundly for the first time in days. A tray next to the bed showed an empty gelatin cup. The radio, playing softly, carried a melancholic tune. The sight hit him with the force of a punch. He had crossed the country to save his business and failed. She had stayed to save his son and succeeded. He approached the bed, guilt weighing on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Elena, who woke with a start. No further explanation was needed. In that hospital, far from the boardrooms and profitability charts, Robert understood the dimension of his mistake. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. His voice was firm, decisive. In front of Elena, he signed his biggest transaction yet, not with a pen, but with words. "Prepare the documents. I am temporarily stepping away from the company's leadership. I need to reorganize my life." The gesture, unthinkable for the billionaire he was, changed the rules of the game. For the first time, real priorities came to the table, not by miracle or chance, but by a conscious, painful choice. Robert's withdrawal from the company leadership was a shockwave that propagated through the financial and social circles of the city. The news, initially treated as a rumor, was confirmed by a sober official statement which spoke of personal matters and reorganization of priorities. To the outside world, it was a sign of weakness, the capitulation of a titan. Inside the penthouse walls, it was the beginning of a new era. The house, formerly a satellite of a financial district office, became the center of the universe. Intimacy, which once sprouted in cracks, now grew like coffee brewed in a filter, slow, fragrant, filling every corner with its presence. The absence of urgent teleconferences and last-minute trips left a void that, at first, Robert didn't know how to fill. He wandered the rooms like a stranger, the silence of the phone an alien sound in his ears. It was Elena, with her practical wisdom, who gave him a new script. She didn't invite him for grand conversations or deep reflections. Instead, she handed him a knife and a cutting board. "Leo likes squash soup, but we need to chop the squash first," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And so, Robert, the man whose hands signed contracts moving millions in stocks, learned to cut vegetables. His first cuts were clumsy, irregular. He oversalted, burned the garlic more than once, and felt ridiculously incompetent. But, for the first time, he was producing something real, something that would feed his son. He laughed at himself, a rusty, awkward laugh that gradually became more genuine. He began participating in the rituals. He kissed Leo's forehead before bed, a gesture that previously seemed to belong to a parenting manual he'd never read. He discovered that his son loved the noise of keys and that the sound of a zipper opening could elicit a laugh. In this fragile calm, both their defenses began to yield. Eleanor, who had always held her body and her history up as a shield, allowed herself to be vulnerable. One night, while watching Leo sleep, she told Robert the origin of her almost infinite patience. She spoke of a younger brother, whom she lost in childhood to a sudden illness. She recounted how her brother, in his last days, also stopped eating, and how she, a girl at the time, felt desperate helplessness. "I recognize the same hunger in Leo," she said, her voice choked. "It's not hunger for food, Mr. Sterling. It's hunger for presence, for safety." She collected rituals, the foam mat always in the same place, the same cups. The spoon always blue, because she knew that predictability was a safe harbor for a child adrift. Robert, in turn, understood his own defense mechanism. The obsessive control over his fortune was a reflection of his inability to control emotions, the chaos of life. Stepping away from work was his way of admitting defeat. Peace, however, is a volatile commodity in the market of human relations. Amidst this domestic truce, a new proposal arrived, not for Robert, but for Elena. An image consultant, subtly linked to his ex-partner's family, approached her. The offer was tempting: a job in a diplomat's home with a salary paid in dollars, a chauffeured car, and the promise of a stable life free from exposure. The implicit condition was clear: she should disappear from Robert and Leo's life, eliminating the noise of her presence before the custody hearing. The proposal was made during a discreet lunch at a cafe. Leo, who was present, didn't understand the words, but felt the tension. When the consultant used the phrase, "a new opportunity for you to start over," the boy, who was drawing on a napkin, stopped. He heard the word "start over," the same one associated with his mother's departure. His eyes widened. He had a meltdown right there in the middle of the cafe. He started biting the sleeve of his t-shirt, a tic he hadn't had in weeks. He slid from the chair and hid under the table, trembling. He refused the mini cheese biscuits, the only thing he would accept, eating out. Elena, seeing the panic in the boy's eyes, didn't even need to think. She looked at the consultant, her cup of coffee untouched, and refused the offer. Her loyalty was not a negotiable asset. It was a therapeutic resource, and her most important patient was trembling under the table, terrified by the simple idea of losing her. Elena's refusal was a silent act of rebellion, a declaration that her value was not tied to dollar proposals or promises of an easier life. Leo's meltdown at the cafe, however, left a trail of apprehension. The boy's fragility was a constant reminder that the peace they had built was delicate as a spiderweb, and that any strong wind could unravel it. Robert, upon learning of the proposal and his son's reaction, felt a chill. He realized the web of influences moving in the shadows, an attempt to isolate him, to remove the pieces he was clumsily trying to put together to rebuild his family. The custody hearing was approaching, and he knew that every gesture, every detail, would be examined under a merciless magnifying glass. This was not a business environment where logic prevailed. It was a theater of emotions, and his adversaries were masters in the art of manipulation. On a late afternoon of light rain, the kind that leaves the city looking like an old film, the tension in the penthouse was palpable. Leo was quiet, drawing on a napkin with a blue crayon. Robert tried to read a report on investment funds, but the words danced on the page, meaningless. He looked at his son's drawing. It was a simple, childish sketch. There was a tall, mirrored building, a tiny, sad sun squeezed into a corner of the sky, and 3 stick figures. A taller one, a smaller one, and a third one in a skirt holding the smaller figure's hand. Robert felt a lump in his throat. The building was unmistakable, the headquarters of his company, the glass and steel monolith where he mentally lived. The taller figure was him, and the figure in the skirt, his son's anchor, was Elena. The drawing was an emotional map, a diagnosis no psychologist could have made with such clarity. It showed where he was and where his son needed him to be. At that instant, an idea, bold and perhaps imprudent, took shape in his mind. It was a turning point, a break in the script. He stood up, the report forgotten on the sofa. "We're going out," he said. Elena looked at him, surprised. The rain beat against the windows. "Now? Where to?" Robert took Leo's hand. "We're going on a picnic." 20 minutes later, the car stopped in front of the imposing commercial building. The doorman, accustomed to seeing him arrive for strategic meetings, stared in astonishment at the picnic basket and the boy in pajamas. Robert led them to the private elevator and went up to his floor, the seat of his power. The office was empty, silent, bathed in the grey light of the late afternoon. He didn't turn on the fluorescent lights. Instead, he walked to the immense floor-to-ceiling windows, opened the curtains, and revealed the view of the West Side Highway, the car lights forming a river of gold and ruby across the concrete landscape. There, on the floor of his office, on the expensive carpet that had been trod by some of the richest men in the country, he spread out a blanket. Elena, understanding the beauty of the gesture, took the mini cheese biscuits they had made earlier and a thermos of sparkling cranberry juice from the basket. The 3 sat, in silence, looking at the city outside. And then, the small miracle, the consequence of that reversal. Leo, who never ate in strange environments, took a biscuit. He looked at his father, at the building that had always been his rival, and he ate. He ate without running away, without hesitation. In that moment, the space that had always stolen his father's presence, the symbol of his absence, was transformed. It ceased to be the fortress of business and became the scene of a good memory, an impromptu picnic above the rain. Robert looked at Eleanor, and his eyes spoke something he still didn't have the courage to verbalize. He wasn't just fighting for his son's custody. He was fighting for that new configuration, for that improbable family that was born on a kitchen floor and was now asserting itself in the empty heart of his former empire. The office picnic was a small victory, a symbolic act that altered the family's emotional geography, but on the custody chessboard, it was a risky move. The opposition wasted no time in reacting. The image of Robert taking his son and the nanny to his empty company on a rainy late afternoon was skillfully distorted by his parents, lawyers. In the preliminary hearing, the gesture was presented as further proof of his eccentricity and inability to separate work from family life. Leo's grandmother, a woman of cold elegance and words sharp as glass, was the spokesperson for the accusation. With calculated calm, she described Robert as a man who, even stepping away, couldn't detach from his business temple, dragging the child into an inappropriate and corporate environment. About Elena, she was even crueler. With all due respect, she told the judge, it seems the employee is occupying spaces and roles that do not belong to her, confusing the child and overstepping her boundaries. Robert, sitting next to his lawyer, felt his blood boil. He, accustomed to dominating any negotiation table, felt small, vulnerable. His own mother's words hit him like stones. He trembled, not from cold, but from impotent rage. He wanted to shout, expose the hypocrisy, the distance his parents had always maintained from Leo, the absence of a single phone call to ask if their grandson was better. But his lawyer restrained him with a touch on the arm. The outburst of rage was exactly what they wanted. It was Eleanor's turn. Called as a witness, she walked to the front of the room with a serenity that contrasted with the room's tension. She didn't wear expensive clothes, nor try to appear as something she wasn't. She was simply herself. With a calm, unwavering voice, she didn't talk about theories or methods. She talked about life. She described Leo's routine, not as a protocol, but as a dance. He wakes up and the first thing we do is open the window to smell the day, she began. She opened her notebook of observations, the same one Robert previously viewed with suspicion, and presented it to the judge, not as proof but as a map. Here, Your Honor, I note the small things, the day he agreed to try squash soup, the song that makes him smile, the fear he has of the vacuum cleaner noise. She spoke of the textures, the smell of the mandarin orange, the importance of the blue spoon. Her narrative was not technical, it was human. She painted a picture so vivid and detailed of Leo's inner life that the accusation of negligence began to sound hollow, absurd. She wasn't occupying a place that wasn't hers. She was filling a void no one else knew how to occupy. The judge, an experienced man with a tired look, listened in silence, leafing through the notebook. In the end, his decision was cautious. He denied the emergency custody petition, but ordered a period of home supervision by a social worker. The war wasn't won, but they had survived the first battle. Upon returning to the penthouse, the relief mixed with a new kind of tension. The house would now be an observed aquarium. Every gesture, every meal, every interaction would be evaluated. And, as if the pressure wasn't enough, one last complication arose. Robert's former fiancée, a woman who always orbited his power and wealth, reappeared. She didn't come with accusations, but with an offer of help. As a public relations professional, she offered to create a positive image campaign for him, to show the world and the judge that he was a dedicated father. The campaign, however, had a clear plan: eliminate all noise. And the main noise, in her view, was Elena. Robert, darling, you need an image of stability, a traditional family. I can help. We can appear together with Leo. We show unity, she said during a tense dinner in the penthouse. The confrontation exploded. The glasses on the table vibrated with the tone of the conversation. Leo, in the next room, heard the raised voices and covered his ears with his hands. Robert finally saw clearly. This wasn't help, it was a power play. For the first time, he chose without hesitation. He ended the pending relationship right there, definitively, and dismissed the consulting. The cost of the decision arrived the next morning in blog headlines calling him unstable and erratic. He didn't care. He was learning that the most valuable asset he possessed couldn't be measured in interest or dividends. The victory in the hearing and the definitive break with his past brought a tense calm. like the silence preceding a storm. The presence of the social worker, a discreet woman named Mrs. Lucia, transformed the routine. Her weekly visits were like emotional audits. She observed, noted on her clipboard, asked gentle but probing questions. Robert felt constantly under evaluation, every gesture heavy with meaning. He tried hard to be the perfect father, but the performance left him exhausted. Elena, on the other hand, acted naturally. She treated Miss Lucia as she would any visitor, offering coffee and a slice of cornmeal cake, talking about the weather and Leo with the same simplicity as always. It was this authenticity that gradually seemed to win over the observer. In this period of scrutiny, Robert and Elena grew even closer. The nights, after Leo was asleep, became a refuge. Sitting in the kitchen, with the city pulsing silently beneath them, they talked, no longer about strategies or problems, but about life. Robert spoke of his lonely childhood, raised by parents who outsourced affection to nannies and boarding schools, repeating a pattern he swore to break but fell into unknowingly. He confessed how money, which should have been a tool for freedom, became a gilded cage, isolating him from real human connections. Elena spoke of her community in the outer boroughs, the support networks, the backyard parties, a wealth not measured in assets, but in bonds. She described the pain of seeing friends and neighbors struggling with difficulties that Robert's capital could solve in an instant, but also the strength and joy that sprang from solidarity. He started to see the world through her eyes. The Saturday market ceased being a chore and became an adventure. He learned to choose the best tomatoes, to talk with the baker, to smell the fresh herbs. He discovered a simple pleasure in carrying the bags, in participating in something so fundamental and terrestrial. He began to understand that the cash flow of a community market, with its exchanges, its shouts, and its colors, was as vital as the stock exchange. Leo flourished in this environment of normalcy. Miss Lucia's visits, which initially made him shy, became part of the routine. He started showing her his drawings, explaining with his childish logic the function of each of his toys. His mouth, once closed, now hummed the AM radio melodies and occasionally risked new words. However, just when everything seemed to stabilize, the shadow of hospitalization returned, more threatening than ever. A strong virus, common during the change of seasons, struck Leo violently. High fever, vomiting, and the most feared consequence, dehydration. He refused to ingest liquids, and within hours, he became apathetic, weak. The pediatrician was blunt. He needed immediate intravenous hydration. It was the all-is-lost moment. The fear that the hospitalization would be used by the opposition as final proof of his incompetence was paralyzing. But the fear for his son's life was infinitely greater. This time, Robert's choice was different. He remembered the last hospitalization, the sterile hospital room, his failure. "We're not going to the usual hospital," he told Elena. "In a sudden decision, the photographers will be there, the curious. That won't help Leo." He made a conscious, almost political choice. He drove to the closest community hospital in Elena's old neighborhood, a place that knew real urgency, far from the spotlight and the airs. The emergency room was packed. The smell of sickness and disinfectant hung in the air. The wait was long, agonizing. Robert, the billionaire accustomed to VIP waiting rooms and immediate attention, sat on a hard plastic bench, his feverish son in his arms, and felt like just another desperate father in the crowd. There were no privileges there, only raw humanity. When they finally got a bed in pediatrics, the situation was desolate. The crying of other children, the sound of the monitors, the cold light. Leo, frightened, curled up, and his refusal to accept even a sip of water became even fiercer. The nurses prepared the IV access, and the boy started trembling with terror. It was rock bottom. That's when Elena, amidst the chaos, took a mandarin orange from her bag. With steady hands, she began to twist the peel, releasing the citrus scent, sweet and familiar, into the air. The aroma invaded the small room, overriding the hospital smell. Leo stopped trembling, his eyes fixed on the fruit. Robert, understanding the signal, started singing the old chorus, the lullaby that united them. His voice cracked, choked by fear and exhaustion, but he didn't stop. The boy, hypnotized by the smell and the music, licked the juice dripping from Elena's fingers. He accepted a spoonful of water, and then he looked at the two of them, the father singing off-key, and the woman with the scent of sun on her hands, and articulated the clearest and most powerful word he had ever said: stay. The word stay, spoken with the clarity born of desperation and comfort, was not just a request, it was a revelation. In that public hospital room, under the cold light and to the sound of a world of pain that was not his own, Robert felt the emotional map of his life completely redrawn. That single word, coming from his son, had more weight and value than all the assets of his vast fortune. It was the confirmation that the family he feared losing was not an ideal to be regained from the past, but a reality to be built, right there, at that exact moment, with the pieces fate had given him. A father learning to stay, and a woman teaching him what presence was. The hospitalization crisis, which could have been the final blow, turned into a catalyst. Leo's improvement was rapid, with hydration, and most importantly, with the security of the continuous presence of the two. He recovered in 2 days. Miss Lucia, the social worker, was informed and visited the hospital. She didn't see a billionaire in a luxury suite, but a father sitting on the floor next to the bed, putting together a puzzle with his son, while the nanny peeled another mandarin orange. She said nothing, but her discreet smile and the report she subsequently wrote reflected what her eyes saw: not an environment of negligence, but a core of genuine affection. Back in the penthouse, the dynamic had irrevocably changed. The word employee silently disappeared from the vocabulary. Elena was Elena, a force, a pillar. Robert, in turn, continued his journey of self-discovery, stepping away from the company, which was initially an emergency measure, began to look like liberation. He realized how much of his identity was tied to his success, to his title of multimillionaire. Without that, who was he? He was Leo's father. He was the man who learned to make squash soup. He was Elena's partner in building a routine of healing. He began to think about the future, not in terms of business expansion or new financial investments, but in terms of purpose. What would he do with all that wealth, with all that power? Now that he understood what truly mattered, the inspiration came from Elena's notebook. Leafing through the pages, he saw not just notes about his son, but a method, a sensitive, human, and effective approach to a difficulty that afflicted thousands of families. He thought of the mothers and fathers he met in the public hospital waiting room, their tired faces, their daily struggle without the support network that his money, ironically, allowed him to have by hiring Elena. An idea began to germinate, an idea that involved using his capital not to generate more profit, but to generate more care. He talked with Elena, not as a boss proposing a project, but as a partner. "What if we took all this, he said, pointing to the notebook, and turned it into something that could help other children, other families that don't have the resources I have?" Elena's eyes lit up. It was the convergence of two worlds, her lived experience and his capacity for execution. They started sketching the project on quiet nights, at the kitchen table, an initiative, a fund, perhaps a foundation. The goal was to create support centers in underserved neighborhoods, offering help to families of children with selective eating disorders and other sensory issues. They would use the resources they already knew, the AM radio music, the street markets as meeting points, sensory cooking workshops. Elena's notebook would become the basis of a method to be shared, and his financial acumen would be used to structure and fund the operation. For the first time in many years, Robert felt a passion for a new business that wasn't about dividends, but about the profitability of hope. He was transforming his greatest suffering into his greatest project. And the woman who entered his life to care for his son was becoming his partner in the task of caring for a piece of the world. The creation of the project, provisionally named the Comfort Initiative, became the new center of gravity in the penthouse. The dining table, formerly the scene of tense, silent meals, was now covered with papers, sketches, and books on child development. Robert immersed himself in the planning with the same intensity he devoted to his investments, but with a radically different motivation. For the first time, return on investment wasn't measured in euros or dollars, but in the potential impact on the lives of children he would never meet. He began using his network of contacts not to close deals, but to consult with educators, occupational therapists, and nutritionists working in low-income communities. He discovered a universe of dedication and scarcity that shamed him for his former alienation. Eleanor was the soul of the project. Her practical experience guided every decision. There's no point in trying to teach a mother to use organic kale if what she has in her pantry is cornmeal, she would say. We have to start from their reality, from the smell of their kitchen. It was her idea to create itinerant sensory kitchens that could be set up in church halls, neighborhood associations, or even street fairs. Robert, the man of big numbers and complex structures, learned from her the beauty of simplicity, of the solution that fits in a handbag and solves the real problem. This working partnership further deepened the personal connection between them. They shared not only the care of Leo, but also the dream of building something lasting. Their mutual admiration grew daily. He admired her wisdom, her quiet strength. She was surprised by his ability to shed the billionaire's armor and show himself vulnerable, willing to learn. Leo, sensing the positive energy and the unity of purpose between the two most important adults in his life, continued to flourish. He participated in the discussions in his own way, drawing logos for the project, usually a smiling mandarin orange, or testing recipes that Elena created for the workshops. The house was full of life, laughter, and the constant smell of baking cake. However, the legal process was still ongoing, a dark cloud on the sunny horizon. The final hearing was scheduled. Leo's grandparents, although informed about their grandson's improvement and the project Robert was starting, did not back down. For them, the issue had become a matter of principle, of pride. Robert's transformation, his closeness to Elena, and his distance from the business world were, in their eyes, further proof that he had lost his way. On the eve of the hearing, nervousness overtook Robert. The fear of losing Leo, despite all the positive changes, was still real. What if the judge interpreted all of this as a performance? What if Elena's humble background was still used to disqualify her? That night, he couldn't sleep. He found Elena in the kitchen, preparing chamomile tea. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice low. "For the first time in my life, I don't have control. No money, no stock can buy tomorrow's outcome." Elena placed the cup in front of him. "You've already won, Mr. Sterling," she said, with her usual calm. "You won your son back. You won yourself back. What happens tomorrow can't take that away." Her words were like a balm. He looked at her, at the woman who had entered his house as a last hope and who had become the foundation of his new life. An emotion he had been repressing for weeks overflowed. It wasn't just gratitude or admiration. It was something deeper, warmer. He held her hand across the table. The touch was hesitant but full of meaning. In that silence, in the kitchen lit only by the city lights, A new possibility, delicate and frightening, was born between them. The possibility of not just being partners in a project or in raising a boy, but partners in life. The day of the final hearing dawned grey and damp, mirroring Robert's state of mind. The touch of hands the night before had left an electricity in the air, an unspoken promise that made everything even more complex and urgent. The future of his fatherhood and the future of his heart would be decided in a matter of hours. The courtroom seemed smaller and more suffocating than the last time. His parents were there, impeccable and distant, accompanied by a new, even more incisive lawyer. The tension was the emotional climax of his entire journey, the peak of all conflicts. The hearing began, and the new lawyer was relentless. She used the Comfort Initiative on project against them, painting it as a public relations maneuver, a desperate attempt to create a favorable image on the eve of the decision. She questioned Elena's qualifications to lead such an initiative, insinuating she was exploiting Robert's fortune for personal gain. Every word was a twist of the knife. Robert felt the anger rise, but remembered Elena's advice. He took a deep breath and remained calm, answering questions objectively, focusing on the facts, on Leo's visible improvement. The testimony of Ms. Lucia, the social worker, was a turning point. With her serene voice and detailed report, she described the transformation she witnessed. She spoke of the office picnic not as an act of eccentricity, but as a successful attempt to re-signify a space of absence. She described the dynamic in the kitchen, the complicity between Robert and Elena in caring for the boy, and Leo's blossoming, who went from an apathetic and silent child to a curious and communicative boy. Her professional and impartial testimony dismantled, piece by piece, the narrative of negligence. The final blow, however, came from an unexpected source. The judge, before making his decision, called Leo for a private conversation in his chambers with the presence of a court psychologist. The conversation was brief. No one knew what was said. When they returned, the boy walked calmly to where his father and Elena were sitting. He said nothing. He just extended his small hands and held, simultaneously, Robert's hand and Elena's hand, intertwining his fingers with theirs. He joined them, and he stood there, between the two, looking at the judge. It was not a rehearsed act. It was instinct, a silent and powerful declaration of where he belonged. That gesture, so simple and so profound, was worth more than hours of legal arguments. It was living proof, the materialization of the family they had formed. Leo's grandmother, seeing the scene, lowered her eyes for the first time, a glimmer of what might be defeat, or perhaps regret, in her gaze. The final act of that war was sealed not by law, but by a bond. The judge's decision was a formality. He maintained custody with Robert, praised the support network formed, and closed the case. As they left the courthouse, the light rain had stopped. A timid sun tried to break through the clouds. There was no explosion of joy, but a deep, shared sigh of relief. They had won. Back in the penthouse, the adrenaline of the battle gave way to a silence charged with emotion. Leo, exhausted, fell asleep on the sofa. Robert and Eleanor looked at each other, the immensity of everything they had been through reflected in each other's eyes. Gratitude, partnership, shared fear, victory, everything converged on that moment. He approached her, slowly. "Eleanor," he began, his voice hoarse. The word Leo said in the hospital, "Stay," wasn't just for that moment. It was for life. He touched her face. The hand that previously only knew how to sign checks, now learning the language of tenderness. "Stay with me." It wasn't an order, nor a job proposal. It was a request. The resolution of his search wasn't just keeping his son, but building a home. And he finally understood that Elena wasn't just the nanny. She was the home he and Leo were both looking for. Robert's request, "Stay with me," lingered in the penthouse air. denser and more significant than the silence that once dominated that place. For Eleanor, those 3 words were more dizzying than any job offer, more valuable than any dollar salary. It was an invitation to cross a border she herself had erected, brick by brick, to protect herself. She looked at him, at the man she had known as a distant billionaire and who now revealed himself in his fragile and newly discovered humanity. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also a new light, a hope she had helped ignite. She thought of her life, her neighborhood, her roots. She thought of the social chasm that separated them, a canyon measured in assets, stocks and surnames. But then she looked at the sofa, at Leo's small, serene figure sleeping, and understood that the only bridge that mattered had already been built. It was a bridge made of lullabies, the smell of mandarin orange, and a trust woven into their daily lives. "I'm already here," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "We are here." It wasn't a passionate yes, but a realization, an acceptance of a truth that already existed. In the days that followed, Robert proved that his transformation was not a temporary reaction to stress. It was a fundamental change in his operating system. He convened his board of directors and, to the shock of the financial market, announced that he was selling a significant stake in his company. It wasn't bankruptcy or giving up, he explained, but a redefinition of his assets. "My primary asset today is my time," he said at the meeting, "and my most important investment is my family." The sale of part of the stock would give him not only more liquidity to finance the Comfort Initiative on a large scale, but more importantly, the detachment necessary to no longer be a slave to his own fortune. He was, in effect, diversifying his life portfolio, moving his capital from the abstract world of business to the concrete world of affection. The last loose end was the relationship with his parents. Robert made the call. The conversation was brief, without accusations or demands. He simply said that Leo was happy and that the doors would be open if they ever wanted to participate in their grandson's life without trying to control it. On the other end of the line, his father, a man of few words, was silent for a long moment and then just said, "He looked well in court. The boy looked well." It was a dignified retreat, the tacit recognition that they had lost not a legal battle, but the chance to understand what their grandson truly needed. The confirmation that everything had been worth it came on a Saturday afternoon. The penthouse kitchen, now the true heart of the house, was filled with the smell of cornmeal cake and the sound of the AM radio. Robert was at the sink, clumsily doing the dishes. Elena was preparing a snack, and Leo was sitting on the floor, drawing. Suddenly, the boy got up, went to Elena, tugged her skirt, and pointed to the drawing. It was a sun, a house, and 3 stick figures, holding hands, smiling. "Look," he said, his voice clear and proud. "Daddy, me, and my second mom." The phrase, spoken with a child's spontaneity, hit Elena hard. Her eyes filled with tears. Robert stopped what he was doing, his hands wet, and looked at the 2 of them. The title he hadn't known how to offer, which he feared would sound like a proposal for substitution, was given by Leo with the purest simplicity. That was the real conclusion. The conflicts had been resolved, not by lawyers or judges, but by time, patience, and the courage to sit on the cold floor. Leo's revelation, with the purity that only childhood possesses, dissolved the last invisible barriers. The title of second mom was not an imposition, but a recognition, a certificate of affection issued by the highest authority in that house. Robert, with damp eyes, dried his hands on the dish towel and knelt on the floor, getting down to their level. He hugged his son and over the small shoulder met Elena's gaze. They didn't need words. In that instant, the kitchen, with its community market refrigerator magnets and the smell of cornmeal cake, became the scene of the signing of the most important contract of their lives. It was a tacit agreement of permanence, of mutual care, a pact of love built on the foundations of patience and overcoming. The penthouse, once a symbol of isolation and cold wealth, had transformed into a pulsating home, a place where true profitability was measured in smiles and spoonfuls of food. Under the Comfort Initiative project gained a life of its own. With the capital Robert injected, what was a sketch in a notebook became a robust foundation. The first support center was inaugurated in Elena's neighborhood, a colorful and welcoming space where the sound of the AM radio was the soundtrack and the smell of mandarin orange welcomed families. The method, based on Elena's notes, became a guide, and local street fairs became meeting and dissemination points. Robert was no longer the distant billionaire. He was Leo's dad, a familiar face in the community, who helped carry boxes and talked with other mothers and fathers about the difficulties and small victories of their children. He found a purpose that no dividend from his stocks had ever provided. On a warm spring afternoon, months after the hearing, the family improvised a picnic in the park. Leo ran after a ball, his loose laughter echoing among the trees. Robert and Elena sat on the blanket watching him. The boy, who used to hide from the world, now ran with open arms toward him. It was the image of healing, the final result of a painful but transformative journey. "Do you remember the first day?" Robert asked, his voice low. "I was ready to fire you. I thought you were just another one." Elena smiled, a smile that lit up her entire face. "And I thought you were just another rich, sad boss," she replied, with gentle sincerity. "I guess we were both wrong." He leaned in, the hesitation that once marked his gestures now replaced by a quiet certainty. "Eleanor, I asked you to stay, and you said you were already here," he began, searching for the right words. "But I want you to stay in a different way, not as help, not as a project partner. I want you to stay as my life partner, as my family." The kiss, when it happened, was discreet, almost shy, aching from existing for so long as a silent possibility and finally finding its moment. It was a kiss with the taste of a fresh start, sealed under the afternoon sun, while the city, far away, lit its first yellow lights. That night, back in the penthouse, while the pot on the stove promised dinner and Leo slept the sleep of the just, they sat at the kitchen table. Love had not solved all the world's problems, but it had given those three lives a new and precious balance, presence, healing, and the conscious, daily choice to begin again. Those who looked on from the outside, judging through headlines and gossip, would have to accept that sometimes the most revolutionary and valuable gesture of all is simply sitting on the cold floor of a hospital and humming softly until a whole life fits again in a simple spoon.